It's my pleasure to actually introduce our first keynote presenter for today, Professor Kate Morris, Director of Centre for Social Work, University of Nottingham. Kate's a qualified social worker who has worked extensively in care and protection before moving into social work education and research. She was a founding member of the group that developed the use of family decision-making in the UK and has continued to research and write about family participation. She's currently working with the Family Rights Group and Professor Brid Featherston to develop a new alliance between families and practitioners that seeks to challenge and change policy and practice responses to highly vulnerable families. Kate is chair of the UK Social Work Education Committee and sits on the Professional Assembly of the College of Social Work. And today her presentation is entitled Exercising Care, Families, Risk and Responsibilities. Please welcome Kate.
Tēnā koutou katoa. I'm Kate Morris. I'm delighted to be here. When Paul invited me to do this, he admitted to tell me that I'd be the first keynote following what I think was just an amazing experience. So it's quite a hard act to follow, really. My thanks to all who've helped organise this conference, to everyone that's made me so welcome, and those that have made the arrangements for my journey. I've drawn so much on the ideas from New Zealand, and in particular the thinking about families and how families support their vulnerable family members. So it's a real privilege to be talking with you today and to share with you some reflections on protecting children and supporting families. I'm just going to try and make sure This is a photograph I took in Wellington last week. Your country is so beautiful, and I'm really honoured to spend some time here. There are many occasions when things don't turn out as you expect, or indeed hope. This picture represents something rare in the life of a parent of a teenager, something I actually got right. The Labrador puppy, I'm told, is the best gift ever. And I'm sharing this because, as with all experiences, I may get some things wrong in this keynote. My UK experiences may jar against your experiences, but as with the gift of the puppy, I hope you'll tolerate any errors on the basis of the intentions being good. And I wanted to begin with a story. I've long believed that in all our families there's an uncle in the tree. That we all experience vulnerabilities, positive and negative family experiences, that there is no us and them, but life experiences that bring with them challenges and strengths. And I remember over a dozen years ago, I was fortunate enough to meet with and work with a man called Murray Ryburn. He was from New Zealand, and actually, strikingly, Murray wore shorts in the most unusual of circumstances. But he was changing the way that England worked with birth families when children were forcibly adopted. He talked about this idea of family decision-making, and it sounded so inspiring that a group of us managed to secure some government funding to develop the use of FGCs in the UK. And a social worker from a small children's team in Hampshire, which is a local authority in England, rang me up and said he'd heard about this and could he join in. So a small group of us began work. And today, FGCs are part of mainstream UK government guidance in the UK, and actually more about that later. And the social worker in the children's team that rang me up and asked to join in, well, over a decade on, he's your chief social worker, and he really hasn't changed a bit. So there are circles for us all in our journeys to make differences for children and families. We have so much to learn from each other, and my trip here has been a wonderful opportunity to learn. My many thanks to all those who've made me so welcome. I'm focused today on families, on how families are engaged in our work, and on how family potential is inhibited or promoted by professional child protection systems and practices. Now, I'd love to be able to offer you a story of success from the UK, that our earlier work introducing a model of family involvement shifted the system and changed practice cultures. Well, maybe that was just too big an ask for FGCs. But I fear I'm here today with a very mixed story, with accounts of families surviving the most challenging of times with amazing fortitude, but also with stories of systems and practices that fracture the help so many families need to thrive and children need in order to enjoy their childhood. And I need to be clear, I spent many years as a practicing social worker, and I'm fully aware of the harm some children experience within their families. But as I learned from my New Zealand colleagues many years ago, the family is the context for resolution. Children are relational beings. To see them as independent islands renders their families invisible, and yet families are critical in the quality of outcomes for children. And in part, my invitation today arises from a book I wrote with my colleagues Breege Featherstone and Sue White. We argue it's a transformational time for child protection, and we sought to consider how we build and sustain humane, family-minded child protection practices, how we design systems that support, not debilitate, and that are fit for purpose in the complex conditions in which we practice. And I'm going to try and spend the next half hour or so talking with you about these ideas. My presentation is going to focus on social work, in part because that's what I know so well, but also because what's happening to social work has profound implications for vulnerable families and their children, for our colleagues in other disciplines, and for local and national child protection systems. The defining of social work has long been a contested territory, but we face a sharp struggle in contemporary child protection about how our profession is positioned and the vision we have for our work. It's a struggle, I think, that goes beyond the borders of our countries. We see common debates emerging in Australia, America, Europe, and I think here in New Zealand. And why does it matter? Well, it is remarkable, isn't it, that despite tragic accounts of individual cases, intense public scrutiny, the vilification of social work and its abilities to protect, we still find that social work is the common characteristic of safeguarding systems. Social work remains a pillar of strategies to keep children safe. So, at the centre of current debates is the critical issue, perhaps now more than ever before, whether social work helps define child protection or child protection defines social work. And by this, I mean the extent to which we've become a risk-saturated profession, with all the compromises that this entails. And this is a theme I'm going to keep revisiting during this talk because it's got such important implications for children and their families. So in order to understand why debates about the ideological drivers for social work matter so much in child protection, I think we've got to begin by considering what's happening for families, the context in which families must seek to survive. For families in the UK, I don't think there's been a more unequal time in living memory. Repeatedly, analysts describe growing inequalities, with the poorest in society suffering the hardest consequences of economic and fiscal policies. And we know this isn't unique to the UK, and that internationally, growing inequalities causes major concerns across societies. Internationally, there are differences in the demographics and the characteristics of the families with the least. For example, you can see race and ethnicity playing a more pronounced role in some countries and some communities. But universally, the impact of inequality is serious for well-being. Inequality is linked to multiple poor outcomes: poor mental health, family violence, domestic abuse, morbidity, drug use. For families, the consequences of inequality are real, and living with inequality and poverty places a constant strain on family life. Poverty and deprivation gets under your skin. It's not just material consequences. It brings with it shame and suffering. Painful experiences become internalised and are represented in destructive ways. In our recent book, we pay particular attention to these notions of suffering and shame, and we argue that whilst understanding the emotional lives of adult family members doesn't excuse abuse or harm, it does encourage important conversations and the capacity for change. We must be watchful of our practices. The evidence points to inequality widening the gap between groups, and thus between social workers, child protection professionals and families. This distance has a serious implication for our capacity to connect and respect families, communities and cultures. But we're also witnessing a growth in formal interventions. As this slide demonstrates, we've seen in the UK a staggering increase in child protection activity, a trend shared by a number of other countries. Not so much, I think, in New Zealand. I think your spike is much more around children in the care system. But obviously these are connected. The research by Paul Bywaters and my colleagues in the UK examined the relationship between the levels of deprivation and the varied rates of care and intervention protections across England. You are 12 times more likely to have your child as subject to care or protection interventions if you live in the 10% poorest areas. And indeed, you are even more likely to be the subject of care and protection interventions if you are poor in an affluent area. This finding provokes many questions, not least how does child protection practice respond to poverty and deprivation in the context of inequalities? It's clear that poverty and deprivation increase the chances of your children being removed from your care and increases the chances of your child being the subject of child protection. But in a way, the findings raise more questions than they answer. And during the next 2 years, we're going to be building on this early work to understand what actually occurs in practice that plays out this link between deprivation and inequality. But in the interim, I think we need to ask ourselves some moral and ethical questions. Is it right that we remove poor children from poor families and leave their parents to struggle in a society riven by inequalities? Is it a just settlement that families who have the access to the fewest resources must also face the greatest likelihood of the most intrusive of practices, namely an assessment to see if their child is safe? I think these are difficult but necessary questions, and they ask us to consider really carefully the role of child protection in the context of inequality. The political positioning of vulnerable families as troubled and troublesome, I think is a policy term that's evident in the UK, but I think also to some extent here in New Zealand, means families are experiencing a narrative that increasingly turns the spotlight on what's argued to be their individual failings. Families hear and see politicians described as feckless failing cohort of families, families that are willfully resistant to change, a picture of multi-generational dysfunctionality. And this is a quote from our previous minister. He went some months ago. He was deemed to be toxic. But one wonders why. This quote is a stark example of the current narratives about vulnerable families. And these narratives are not restricted to the UK. Such narratives grow the divide between practitioners and families. But I'm going to suggest to you today that this screen and intervene approach cannot be our mantra for protecting children. Otherwise, we create a legacy of alienation and anger within communities and families. My own research reveals the resistance built within families by repeated assessments of risk, with few services offered if the thresholds aren't met. Families hold stories about services, and this story is passed through the kinship network, impacting the capacity to engage with hopeful change before any contact occurs. Seeking to ascertain individual risk through repeated assessment can't offer productive avenues for building protective relationships. A wise woman once said to me, after years of designing and leading preventative services, if you want to help children, then it's all about love and money. I suspect there's much right in this analysis. A clinical model of family risk and family change can only be part of the story and may be a small part where social adversity is extreme. But a movement away from a vision for social work that embraces social justice has growing currency in international debates, with the rise of worrisome developments in risk prediction and management. We can be gullible and open to the misuse of knowledge. In our book, we examine the use and misuse of neuroscience. It's not a focus for me today, but it's a very strong example of the politics of evidence. And so with this changing focus for social work towards forensic practices, I think we've got a potentially toxic scenario emerging. And I think it goes something like this. Social work interventions become narrowed to specific evidence-based models, all with an unrelenting focus on risk. Austerity means diminished helping resources, and we hear the rise of a punitive political narrative about families. In this scenario, families struggling to cope with extreme adversity become the site of intervention, with services preoccupied with assessing their capacity to manage risk. We ask families to cope better, to parent better, to be resourceful where kinship care is needed. Challenging and changing the adverse conditions that families must survive in becomes the business of others, of those not engaged with the task of protecting children. Now, I think this scenario, to put it mildly, is an odd place to be. If the research tells us that inequality and deprivation are directly linked to the rates of intervention, why would we evolve practices and policies that disconnect child protection from social and economic concerns? Aren't we kind of ending up paddling with just one oar? As we consider family involvement in care and protection, inequality becomes an important lens through which we might better understand vulnerable families, and suggests it's not enough to simply seek to manage the internal risk dynamics of a family. By addressing the relationship between child protection practice and deprivation, we've got the potential to make a profound difference to families' lives. I think we must re-engage with what's been described as the causes of the causes. Our research shows this to be a complex area where there are considerable further interrogation, but we do need to guard against fashionable notions that distract from the real complexity of protecting children in times of inequality and austerity. I've had the privilege the last few years of conducting a series of studies with families facing extreme adversity, and there are commonalities in all the family narratives arising from these studies, and I just want to spend a little bit of time thinking about those and their implications for collectively how we protect children. For families facing extreme adversity, day-to-day life is a tough call. They are acutely aware of being different, being marked out, and the consequences for their children. And I shared this story when I spoke at Adelaide University a couple of days ago. At the end of a recent fieldwork interview, I asked a mother of 7 children who'd worked with child protection services for over a decade, if she could have one thing that would make a difference, what would it be? And I'd anticipated a conversation maybe about a damp-proof house, a working washing machine, or indeed, in her case, a reliable bloke. But her answer was a holiday. She'd never been able to take her children on holiday. She wanted to know what a family holiday felt like. But also, she wanted her children not to have to skip school at the start of term because they didn't want to go when everybody else was talking about the holidays they hadn't been able to have. In this one tiny example, so much is present: shame, suffering, exclusion from mainstream experiences. But, and I think here's the rub, every autumn, this woman had a tough time with the agencies because of the level of truancy by her children. She's both defeated by life experiences and defeated by the services that seek to help her. Remarkably little is known about family practices in extreme adversity, about how families do family in these conditions. It's a gap in research, and I think it inhibits our capacity to develop effective services. I think we're still refining and developing our skills within child protection to create and sustain truly family-minded practice and policy. You can only generate the rates of intervention I shared earlier if you render invisible the human cost to families and adult family members, and merely focus on whether you can arrive at a measure of riskiness for a child. I've seen and learnt loads in New Zealand concerned with family-minded practice, so much to take back with me to the UK. How families understand we understand them has been an important strand within my research. Families can articulate, as you can see here, what they see as professional impressions of their family practices. For me, it's really interesting that no family in any of my studies was able to accurately describe who was in their life and why. Yet they could almost all tell me how they thought they would be described by professionals. My data suggests that professional assessments processes struggle at times to capture family practices, and consequently struggle to provide sustained support for family care practices once families have made plans for vulnerable family members. Our failure to do so leaves families only either partially understood or struggling to cope with complex caregiving. I think we do have examples internationally of imaginative protective practice that keys into family practices. I think the trick's going to be ensuring this learning is shared and built upon, and I hope that this conference is an important opportunity to do so. Let me just consider briefly two more themes evident across the data, both connected to our thinking around humane, family-minded approaches. We've argued that with the rise of authoritarian child protection projects in the UK, we've become really rusty in having conversations about help. We are preoccupied by models and techniques concerned with risk management and prediction, and we grow distant from discussions about help and needs. I think reclaiming conversations about worries, support, capability in protecting children will build different relationships. This quote from a young mother reveals the worst excesses of the current screen and intervene mode of practice. Families in my studies repeatedly describe short-term investigations and assessments, sometimes possibly followed by short-term targeted help. This succession of interventions created a family narrative about services, a narrative of frustration, anger, and at times abandonment. There are interesting questions for us here that generate critical practice dilemmas. How do we respond to the model of child protection driven by a risk-averse culture when we know families need flexible practice and workers that are confident in being creative? How do we manage complex interagency arrangements when actually imagination is needed in our responses to fluctuating degrees of concern, need, and capability? I think social work done well is informed improvisation. And it's difficult to find a fit between this vision for practice and the rise of standardized technical solutions to risk that remove the opportunities for reciprocity and respectful exchange. In my research where practitioners had listened and sought that reciprocal relationship, families described a real difference. And this is a long quote, but it's a really heartfelt description from a woman who's had years and years of child protection involvement. And this links to my second theme. Underpinning much of my analysis is the notion of care. And it's ironic, isn't it, that care is such a pivotal concept to understanding family life in adversity, and yet families repeatedly talk about the careless nature of our systems and practices. In our study of families who'd taken part in a child protection case review, this is a serious case review, it's where a child's died as a result of abuse or neglect. Families felt bruised by these careless experiences, and inadequate support often left them further distressed. And the top quote reflects this. But families also talked about demonstrated care in a practice in the most extraordinary of circumstances. And the second quote comes from a mother whose daughter was killed, and for her, the very human gesture of sorting out her washing was profoundly important. These experiences were building blocks for future work. Their imprint on the family's perceptions of the child protection services was far greater than the scale of the actual practice episode. Care as an organising concept for our services and our practices has been much neglected, despite the evidence from multiple studies of its centrality to practice. I think family group conferences offer us a glimpse into family practices, and in particular family care practices. We see how families mobilise around an ethic of care, how family practices provide emotional as well as practical care for vulnerable family members. But I think our contemporary child protection processes struggle to find spaces and places for family care practices. In an increasing regulated and managed approach to practice, the kind of messy, shape-shifting notion of care is pushed to one side. In a world of quality assurance, inspection and regulation, care is a challenging concept. But in my studies, families consistently articulated an intuitive sense of care-minded or careless practice. And this is a brilliant quote from a family who'd had multiple different workers who could really articulate what that felt like. I think interrogating and better understanding the concept of care is a critical ingredient. If we weave care conceptually and practically into child protection, we will arrive at some profoundly different arrangements for helping children and families thrive. This slide summarises the dimensions identified in a study that examined care within families when difficult times were experienced. The research indicates that even the most turbulent of times, families seek to do right by their vulnerable family members. And the message from such studies is that if we can create authentic spaces in our practice for families to exercise this ethic of care, protection may take on a new appearance. My time here in New Zealand suggests we've got much to learn from your work in this area. And in my concluding section, I just want to turn a little bit to consider doing things differently. Despite these choppy waters, we've seen the development of models of practice that seek to work differently with families. Criminology discovers two models of help, contrasting the traditional model, which he describes as a coalition of despair, with one that can be seen as a covenant of help. Such an approach is rooted in a strengths-based and right-based narrative. It sees families as both having the rights to care and the capabilities to build on to achieve change. Models such as this do not assume all families can care safely. Instead, they seek to arrive at an honest understanding about how best to meet a child's needs. But such models demand a different conversation between practitioners and families and a different policy framework for help and support. They ask us to listen, understand, reflect and refine, to adopt a dynamic understanding of practice. They require that no conversation is out of bounds, and they demand that we know intimately the family's world. Let me just take a moment to consider a little further the families who participated in case reviews. This study, whilst deeply troubling, offered some critical insights. The data from the families provided examples of professionals having the most difficult of conversations with skill and empathy. They also, sadly, described practice that was preoccupied with procedural compliance, reputational risk and accountability to management structures, rather than a focus on the child and the learning. We know from our study that participation in this context is ethically and professionally demanding, but done well offers unique insights that can make a real difference. The examples of excellent practice provided sharp illustrations of the value of strength-based, respectful approaches. And in even this area of most difficult and painful practice, we can see how a covenant of hope can make such a difference. And this is a quote from an adult family member where another adult family member and children had been killed as a result of another adult family member's actions. I haven't read the other quotes out, but I want to read this one out because I think it's profound, really. I talk about having imaginative, creative people. I'm thinking, please, please come to the table and believe you can do something. This is a message to agencies. You know, think about it. You're being given this story of a human being who is no longer here. It's so important that you take that really seriously. And you know, it may be that you don't achieve anything, but let's give it the best possible chance. But for many families, they described a focus upon risk assessment and risk management that resulted in families receiving too little for too long and too much too late, to quote my friend Danny Canway. So the search is on for models based on a covenant of hope at a time when resources are shrinking and are increasingly focused on interventionist practices. I want to share two quick examples with you of approaches that are bucking the trend, really, where families are working closely with professionals in respectful relationships to arrive at shared agendas, and needs are understood in the context of inequality and unjust access to resources. My first example dwells on relationships, something we know to be the golden thread in building positive outcomes for children and families. The recent care inquiry in the UK made explicit the critical importance of unbroken relationships between the child, family and professionals. But it also identifies a growing trend towards multiple specialist services that actually fragment help and break relationships. Hilary Cottam and colleagues based in a small organisation called Participle are developing the concept of relational welfare, a notion that we need to create new spaces and systems. I'm just going to give you a quick quote from Hilary. What we need is a truly responsive welfare state that builds on the capabilities of all, services that value and build on relationships. We must have a system that understands loneliness kills, that you need a social network to find a job when 80% of jobs are not advertised, that you need someone to stand by your side when you've grown up in a community that no longer remembers decent work and you're confronting all the problems of violence, depression and anxiety that go along with this. We call this relational welfare. They've piloted new models. They've developed a program called Life, which worked with the most marginalised of families by embedding staff within the community, by giving families the right to interview and choose their worker, by building intensive supportive relationships based on capabilities. The approach recognised that multiple change must occur for highly vulnerable families to thrive, and that this includes changing the services that surround them and their access to social and economic capital. The project was small scale, but its impact was significant, and if you're interested in this after the keynote, I'm more than happy to share connections with you. Let me also draw attention to Your Family, Your Voice. It's a national UK alliance, and in fact its existence reflects the high level of concern in the UK about the impact of the changes I've described in child protection. And just to go off script very briefly, very bravely, I've had a wonderful opportunity to talk to social workers here, and I really want you to look at the UK and draw a deep breath and do some serious thinking, because there are seeds of change here that we are reaping the price of in the UK. The Alliance reflects not only the high level of concerns, but all the hopes and aspirations of those concerned with transforming systems. What initiatives such as LIFE and this Alliance demonstrate is sometimes that in the face of enormous pressure, we do build new opportunities. And indeed, in the words of Maya Angelou, a diamond is the result of extreme pressure. Less pressure is crystal, less than that is coal, and less than that is fossilised leaves or just plain dirt. So given the enormous challenges facing families, you flag a bit towards the end, bear with me. Models that build on capabilities and have respectful relationships at their core become important beacons of hope. And I want to tell you a concluding story. I became really disillusioned with the adoption of FGCs in the UK. I was so worried that they'd become a mechanism for either finding kinship care placements or getting families to sign off professional plans. I can see people nodding, so it's obviously a universal concern. There was really little evidence of practice or organisational change in family services. But then recently I spent some time in Leeds, a city that's made a major investment in becoming a restorative city, with FGCs at the heart of these plans. I was privileged to spend time with a group of women, all of whom had experienced repeat removals by child protection agencies of previous children. We have this term sequential removals. I don't know if that's familiar to you. Don't let it become familiar to you. Some children were placed for adoption, others with kinship carers, and others in long-term foster placements. What all these women had in common was that following involvement with the new FGC service, their current baby remained with them. This is a story of heartache and happiness. Some women were dealing simultaneously with adoption proceedings for their other children while caring for their new child. But all talked about new opportunities opening up when defensive practice was replaced by strength-based conversations. This quote comes from Open Dialogue, a radical approach to mental health care. I don't know if you have Open Dialogue here. No. At its heart is a sincere attempt to build collaborative healing processes with the full and active involvement of those experiencing mental health problems. The connections to my reflections today are self-evident. I've suggested that by reconnecting practice and systems that allow for joint meanings to emerge and collaboration to develop in protecting children, we can reimagine child protection and grow humane practices. I want to finish today by looking forward and offering what we suggest in our book to be some key principles for the development of humane child protection and family support. We draw heavily on the work of Hilary Cottam here. Her model of relational welfare has much to offer our discussions about child protection. We do think it's time for a new deal for families, and I hope very much that our debates in the UK may have some relevance and value in your debates over the next few days in protecting children. The book suggests a set of principles that we must attend to if we are to arrive at a settlement between the state and the family that sees children flourish, families exercise their capacity to care, and professionals to become part of the solution, not perceived as the problem. And I'm just going to talk a little about each of these principles. Take care of root causes. It's essential that we recognise the need to develop and support approaches to practice that are not about rescuing individual children from impoverished families and communities. We need to stop treating symptoms as causes, and we must develop robust research on the lived experiences of those who struggle to survive in a society where they face major obstacles to achieving a life of dignity and worth. Adopt a developmental approach. We need to use approaches that fulfill our responsibilities to intervene where there is harm without risk becoming the dominant paradigm. We really remain concerned about the difficulties of bringing strength-based models into a system so saturated with risk, and the extent to which real opportunities exist for communities to drive the design of helping practices and systems. Be infrastructure light and relationship heavy. And I want to reconnect here with my earlier discussions about care as an organising principle. Using care as a founding principle encourages practices and services to consider capabilities. But it doesn't imply that we only experience careful relationships. But if we maintain risk as the dominant paradigm in which we practice and in which we understand the lives we seek to change, then our work will be unsafe and unlimited. Seed and champion alternative models. We should be modest about what is knowable and what is not. We spend a great deal of resource servicing the pretense of certainty. We are desperate for some certainty in a morally complex and difficult world, and we will grasp it when we're presented with it. Sue White calls it the allure of science, that we as a profession, and indeed I suspect this spans across child protection, we seek certainty, and actually learning to live with uncertainty is probably the most profoundly helpful place to be. Our capacity to help is strengthened by understanding there may be a range of options, that practice is dynamic and presents multiple opportunities as dialogues progress. A deterministic what works agenda driven by external expertise will limit and distort our ability to help. Facilitate the dialogue. In our book, we argue for new forms of conversation. We seek to arrive at practices that enable honest dialogues to develop, unfettered by preset agendas. We examine system design that results in the creation of fleeting conversations that are aimed at somehow referring on an expression of need elsewhere. We argue that this lacks both humanity and sense. The next stage of our journey is to take these principles and build models for practice that offer families a different way of working with us. And by doing so, we hope we can offer a vision of practice rooted in a coalition of hope. Sue, Breege and I know would be delighted to hear from you, both your reflections on our analysis and your suggestions for such models. So you'll recall my starting point about actually managing to get something right for once with a teenage daughter. Well, I think any analysis of existing practice bears many resemblances. This photograph is from a family holiday, and as you can see, my son loved it. In part because he genuinely loved the Outer Hebrides, and in part because his sister hated it. Sometimes we can only get some of it right, some of the time. And we must not only review the problems, we must celebrate the successes as well. I'm sure everyone in this room has sought to make a difference to the lives of children and families. And in reflecting on the challenges facing us, I think we should also be proud of the work done well. Thank you.